Welcome to the new video of Neurophilos. Get ready to dive into a gripping tale that will leave you breathless, thinking, and inspired. Whether you're here for the mystery, the drama, or the unexpected twists, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Let's begin. The Golden Prison. Have you ever reached a moment in life when, from the outside, everything appears complete? Career stable, relationships intact, finances secure, yet a quiet unease hums beneath the surface. It is the kind of emptiness that whispers rather than shouts. You look around at the life you've built and ask, is this all there is? Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist whose insights reshaped modern psychology, gave this strange discomfort a name: Sunday neurosis. He noticed it among people who, after achieving everything they had once longed for, found themselves mysteriously hollow. They were not struggling for survival or recognition. They had already won the social game. And yet, when the noise of the week subsided and Sunday's stillness arrived, an unexplainable sadness surfaced, a quiet protest from within. To Jung, this was not laziness or ingratitude. It was the soul protesting the way life had been constructed. He saw that many of his patients had built lives of glittering success, but with foundations disconnected from their inner truth. They had chased goals imposed by others, worn masks demanded by society, and followed rules that promised happiness but delivered exhaustion. The result was what Jung called a golden prison, beautiful, admired, perfectly decorated, but suffocating. From the outside, it gleamed with the polish of accomplishment, promotions, recognition, comfort. From the inside, it felt airless, because the one person missing from that success story was the true self of the person living it. Jung believed that this phenomenon was not a psychological flaw, but a spiritual warning. When the outer life expands faster than the inner life, the psyche rebels. The individual experiences restlessness, irritability, or a vague melancholy that no achievement can cure. No matter how much money is earned or how many milestones are reached, the sense of meaning continues to slip away. The modern world teaches us to measure worth through visible progress, degrees, salaries, followers, possessions. We are told that if we keep climbing, we will one day arrive at fulfillment. But the truth Jung uncovered is that achievement without alignment only multiplies the emptiness. Success becomes another addiction, one more project, one more purchase, one more compliment to silence the inner void. And then Sunday comes. The phone stops buzzing, the schedule clears, and the silence that follows becomes unbearable. Beneath that silence lies something sacred, what Jung called the cry of the soul. It is the part of us that refuses to be soothed by comfort, because it was never seeking comfort, it was seeking meaning. People often respond to this discomfort by working harder or distracting themselves, mistaking the soul's cry for boredom. They add noise instead of listening. But Jung urged his students and patients to pause, to resist the reflex to fill every gap. The emptiness, he said, is not an enemy to eliminate. It is an invitation to turn inward. The pain of Sunday neurosis is the psyche's way of saying, you have built a life admired by everyone except yourself. This realization can be terrifying because it challenges everything we have been taught about success. Society celebrates the persona, the social mask that smiles, performs, and achieves, but neglects the inner being behind it. When the mask becomes too tight, when it demands too much pretending, the soul begins to suffocate. That suffocation is the quiet dread people feel when they should be happy but are not. It is the sense of living someone else's script, of moving efficiently but aimlessly. Jung observed that no amount of external progress can compensate for the absence of inner connection. The human spirit, he said, cannot thrive on borrowed meaning. And so the golden prison stands as a warning for anyone who confuses admiration with fulfillment. You may decorate its walls with every symbol of success, yet without authenticity, its doors remain locked. The key is not out there in more work or recognition. It lies in the neglected dialogue with the self. Jung's insight remains radical even today. The goal of life is not to be successful, but to be whole. To reach that wholeness, one must dare to question the life that looks perfect but feels wrong. The moment you start asking why the silence feels heavy, you have already begun the journey back to yourself. Because the truth is this: emptiness does not arise from lack. It arises from disconnection. And when the soul is exiled from its own story, even the brightest achievements lose their light. The golden prison shines only until you realize you are its prisoner.
The mask and the self. From the moment we are born, the world begins to hand us roles to play. Be a good child. Earn high grades. Make your parents proud. Later the lines are rewritten. Build a career, be productive, get married, buy a home. Each instruction sounds harmless, even noble. Together they form the invisible script of a successful life. Most people follow it with discipline, believing it will lead to peace. Yet somewhere along that road, a quiet question begins to surface. Whose life am I really living? Carl Jung saw this pattern in almost every patient who came to him. He called it identification with the persona, the process by which we confuse the face we show the world with the person we actually are. The persona is the mask we craft to survive within society. It allows us to function, to be polite at dinner tables, competent in meetings, charming at gatherings. It is not evil, it is necessary. Without some form of persona, chaos would reign. But the danger begins when the mask hardens and the wearer forgets that it is a mask. The persona is built from the expectations of others. Parents who want pride, employers who want performance, cultures that demand obedience. Piece by piece, we construct an image designed to win approval. We learn what earns smiles and what invites disapproval, and soon the mask becomes second nature. The world claps and we mistake that applause for love. But beneath the applause, another voice whispers, one we learn to ignore. That voice belongs to what Jung called the self, the organizing center of the psyche, the source of creativity, intuition, and meaning. The self does not care about reputation or achievement. It seeks authenticity, coherence, and truth. While the persona looks outward for validation, the self looks inward for purpose. The more one invests in the former, the fainter the latter becomes. Jung described this imbalance as the seed of inner emptiness.
Imagine a person who spends decades constructing an impeccable facade, a brilliant professional, admired by colleagues, envied by friends. Yet to maintain that image, they suppress their sensitivity, dismiss their curiosity, and silence their deeper longings. They become a perfect actor in a play that no longer resembles their own life. The world sees success. The soul feels starvation. The tragedy is that society rewards the mask. Promotions, praise, and comfort all reinforce the performance. Few are encouraged to pause and ask, who am I beneath all this? The result is a life lived outwardly for applause and inwardly for survival. Jung warned that the self, when ignored, does not vanish. It retreats to the unconscious and begins to rebel. Its rebellion is subtle at first: restlessness, insomnia, unexplained fatigue, a sense that joy has quietly evaporated. When repression deepens, the rebellion grows louder. Anxiety attacks, depression, sudden apathy toward everything once loved.
The psyche, Jung said, cannot bear living in contradiction for long. What we refuse to face consciously will find its way into our lives as fate. This is why so many who appear fulfilled on paper wake each morning with a sense of dread. Their outer world sparkles, but their inner world feels grey. They live in what Jung poetically described as a house with splendid rooms above, but a dark cellar below. The lights of accomplishment illuminate the upper floors, while the neglected self waits in the basement, whispering through dreams and symptoms. When the mask becomes too heavy, cracks begin to form. A successful executive suddenly resigns without reason. A devoted spouse admits feeling trapped. A respected artist loses the will to create. To outsiders, these collapses look irrational. To Jung, they were sacred breakdowns. The psyche's attempt to restore balance between the persona and the self. He reminded us that healing begins not with achievement, but with awareness. The task is to remember that the mask was meant to serve you, not imprison you. You are not your resume, not your title, not the character you perform to be accepted. Beneath the polished surface lives an unedited being who has been waiting patiently to be acknowledged. To remove the mask is frightening because it threatens everything familiar, the comfort of praise, the illusion of certainty. but what waits behind it is life itself. Jung called this the first step toward individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole. It begins the moment you dare to see the difference between the role you play and the person who plays it. So ask yourself, who would you be if you stopped performing? What would remain if every obligation, every expectation, every disguise fell away? That question, uncomfortable as it is, marks the doorway out of the golden prison and into authenticity. The mask may win admiration, but only the self can give peace. And peace, Jung believed, is not the absence of struggle, it is the presence of truth. The turning point of life. There comes a moment in every life when the pursuit that once felt so meaningful begins to lose its flavor. The trophies that once gleamed with pride start to collect dust, and the applause that once energized you fades into static. For some, this arrives quietly, perhaps while driving home one evening, staring at the same streets you've driven for years. For others, it strikes suddenly, a wave of disorientation that makes even victory feel pointless. Jung called this moment die Wendezeit, the turning point of life. It is not a single event, but a deep psychological shift. The outer structures of life, career, marriage, identity, may remain intact, yet the inner axis begins to rotate. A voice emerges from the depths of the psyche saying, "Enough of living for appearances. Now live for truth." Jung observed that this stage typically arises around midlife, between 35 and 45, though it can arrive earlier for some and later for others. Its arrival is not a sign of failure, but of growth, the soul demanding a new orientation. Until this turning point, most people live in service to the ego and the persona, the outer image that seeks stability, approval, and mastery of the world. These are not wrong pursuits, they are necessary for the first half of life. We must learn to build, to achieve, to carve a place in the social order. Yet when those structures are finally secure, the psyche begins to hunger for something deeper, meaning. And meaning, Jung said, cannot be found through addition. It appears only through integration. That is why success so often triggers crisis rather than satisfaction. The individual who has everything suddenly feels incomplete. The problem is not that life is empty, it's that life has been filled with the wrong things. The outer climb has been completed, but the inner mountain remains untouched. This is the turning point, the soul revolting against the one-sidedness of worldly ambition. Some resist it fiercely, clinging to the old formulas that once worked. They double down on achievement, new goals, new possessions, new distractions, hoping to silence the discomfort. Yet each new triumph feels shallower than the last. Others, trembling but honest, listen. They begin to question, what if the ladder I've been climbing is leaning against the wrong wall? That question marks the beginning of awakening. It is the psyche's rebellion against mechanical living, its demand to exchange repetition for authenticity. Jung described this moment as both terrifying and sacred. Terrifying because it dismantles the illusion of control. Sacred because it reintroduces the individual to the forgotten dimension of the self. Those who ignore the call risk what Jung termed spiritual illness. They may not fall physically ill, yet life begins to decay in subtle ways. Relationships lose depth, creativity dries up. A faint bitterness colors even success. To the world, they appear stable. To themselves, hollow. The soul, denied expression, begins to erode the structures that imprison it. It manifests as boredom, restlessness, even sabotage, forcing change where the conscious mind resists it. But those who answer the call embark on a different kind of journey. They turn inward and discover that the crisis was never about losing direction. It was about outgrowing the old one. The values that once governed their choices start to dissolve. Competition gives way to compassion, ambition to curiosity, image to substance. They no longer seek to be admired. They long to be whole. Jung insisted that this transition is not optional. It is nature's demand. Just as adolescence transforms the child into an adult, the turning point transforms the achiever into a seeker. To refuse it is to remain trapped in perpetual adolescence, busy, successful, yet existentially unfinished. To accept it is to step into the second half of life, guided not by the external map of society but by the internal compass of the soul. The road ahead is uncertain. It asks for honesty, solitude, and courage. It often begins with dismantling. Careers shift, relationships strain, identities crumble. Yet in that disintegration,
lies liberation. What dies is the mask. What emerges is the self. The turning point is not an ending. It is a sacred invitation. Life, for the first time, demands not that you become more, but that you become real.
When the soul protests. There comes a period when the surface of life looks perfectly calm, and yet, underneath, the currents are violent. Outwardly, nothing is wrong. The job continues, the relationship endures, the routine remains intact. But inside, something begins to tremble. It is as if a hidden part of you has decided to stop cooperating with the performance. You wake, you work, you smile, and still the unease grows stronger. Carl Jung called this stage the protest of the soul. It begins quietly, disguised as fatigue or boredom. You may tell yourself you only need a vacation, a promotion, a change of scenery. But deep down, something far older and wiser has started to rebel. It is the self, the forgotten center of your being, pushing back against years of neglect. When the self is silenced too long, it finds another language. The body starts to speak, through tension, migraines, sleeplessness. The mind sends up strange dreams, symbols of storms, collapsing houses, locked doors. Anxiety appears without a clear source, depression without an obvious cause. To Jung, these were not random malfunctions but messages. The psyche, unable to reach you through reason, uses suffering as a last resort. Pain, he said, is the soul's most faithful messenger. It is easy to mistake this inner revolt for failure. After all, society tells us that distress must mean something has gone wrong. We look for external explanations, work stress, hormones, bad luck, and when none fit, we panic. But Jung urged his patients to view such symptoms differently. Do not silence the voice of suffering, he wrote, for it is trying to tell you what the surface mind refuses to hear. The problem is not the sadness itself, but the refusal to listen to what it wants to reveal. At this stage, many people double down on distraction. They keep themselves endlessly busy, overworking, over-consuming, oversharing, anything to drown out the quiet insistence that something is missing. Others chase reinvention on the surface, a new partner, a new home, a new goal, only to discover that the emptiness follows wherever they go. The reason is simple. The ache is not in the world. It is in the distance between the persona and the self. Jung compared this disconnection to being possessed by one's own mask. The more the persona dominates, the fainter the self becomes, until life feels mechanical, like acting in a play whose script you can no longer remember choosing. Each day repeats the same lines, the same gestures, until one morning you realize you're applauding your own imprisonment. This realization is painful but sacred. It is the soul hammering on the walls of the golden prison. The anxiety, the numbness, the chronic dissatisfaction, all of it is the psyche's attempt to wake you. It does not want you to collapse. It wants you to change. The collapse happens only when the call is ignored. When Jung's patients finally stopped resisting and began to listen, something miraculous occurred. Beneath the symptoms, they found meaning. A panic attack became the body's protest against inauthentic living. Depression revealed buried creativity. Insomnia unveiled the unspoken questions that daylight drowned out. Each crisis, when approached with awareness, transformed from punishment into initiation. The darkness was not an enemy to be killed, but a teacher to be understood. To live through this phase demands courage, the courage to pause. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this feeling?" Jung suggested asking, "What is this feeling trying to tell me?" That single shift of perspective begins the healing. It turns suffering into dialogue. This dialogue may lead you to uncomfortable truths, that your job no longer aligns with your values, that a relationship survives only by habit, that the life you've built is impressive, but not alive. Facing these truths can dismantle everything you've protected. But remember, the purpose of destruction here is not cruelty, it is creation. The persona must crack for light to enter. The protest of the soul is, in essence, the beginning of reconciliation. The symptoms are not punishments but invitations to return home, The more you resist, the louder they become. The moment you listen, truly listen, the noise begins to soften. Because beneath the exhaustion, beneath the restlessness, the soul is not angry, it is longing. Longing to be seen, to breathe, to guide again. And when you finally stop running and turn toward it, something astonishing happens. The very emptiness that once terrified you becomes the doorway to meaning. This is the paradox Jung devoted his life to unveiling. That suffering, when met with awareness, is not the end of the road but the threshold to wholeness. The soul never protests to destroy you. It protests to bring you back to yourself. The return to the self. Comes a moment when resistance becomes impossible. The distractions that once numbed you no longer work. The noise of daily life quiets, and what remains is the one thing you've avoided the longest: silence. In that silence, the truth finally steps forward. The soul that has been whispering for years now speaks plainly. You cannot keep living this way. Most people, when faced with inner emptiness, instinctively look outward for a cure. They change jobs, partners, and cities. They chase new goals, buy new things, adopt new routines. But Carl Jung warned that no external solution can fix what is, at its core, an inner misalignment. The system that created the emptiness cannot heal it. True healing, he said, begins only when one turns inward, when attention shifts from what the world expects to what the soul needs. This inward movement is not comfortable. Jung called it the process of individuation, a lifelong journey toward wholeness. It requires dismantling the carefully built persona, the facade of control and perfection, and facing the parts of yourself you've denied, the shadow, the vulnerability, the forgotten dreams. Individuation is not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before you learned to hide. At first, the process feels like destruction. You begin to see how much of your life was built on borrowed meaning, the career chosen for status, the marriage maintained for image, the habits inherited from other people's expectations. These realizations can shatter your sense of identity. You may feel lost, even foolish. But Jung insisted that this collapse is sacred. There is no birth of consciousness without pain. To rebuild, one must first allow the old structures to die. Sometimes that means walking away from a job that no longer feels alive. Sometimes it means ending a relationship that has become a performance. Sometimes it means sitting in the quiet of your own company, stripped of all the labels that once defined you. Each act of letting go is an act of faith. Faith that something truer will emerge in the space that remains. And it does. Slowly, the fragments begin to realign. You start to hear faint signals from the self, impulses that once felt too small to matter, the urge to paint again, to walk in nature, to speak honestly, to rest without guilt. These are not random whims. They are the soul's compass, pointing you toward authenticity. Jung taught that this return to the self is not a retreat from the world, but a reconciliation with it. When the ego stops trying to dominate, life regains balance. Work becomes expression instead of obligation. Relationships deepen because they are built on truth rather than performance. Even solitude transforms. No longer loneliness, but belonging to oneself. Yet the path is not without sacrifice. You cannot become whole and still remain who you were. Something must always be surrendered. An illusion. A role, a comfort, a false certainty. Jung compared this to alchemy. The ego must burn before gold can be revealed. It is not punishment, it is purification. As the process unfolds, the fear of emptiness fades. You realize that the void was never absence. It was space waiting to be filled with meaning. The silence that once frightened you becomes a sanctuary. You begin to see life not as a ladder to climb, but as a circle to complete. A journey back to the center, where the self quietly waits. And when you finally stand in that center, something remarkable happens. The restless need to prove yourself dissolves. The comparisons, the chasing, the endless measuring, all of it loses power. What remains is a quiet, steady presence. The self does not shout, it simply is. This is what Jung meant when he said that the goal of life is not perfection, but wholeness. To live from the self is to live without masks, to act, create,
and love from a place that asks for no audience. It is the freedom of being inwardly aligned even when the outer world misunderstands you. The return to the self is not a final destination. It is an ongoing dialogue between who you are and who you are becoming. It demands honesty, patience, and compassion for your own humanity. But once begun, there is no turning back, because once you've tasted truth, illusion loses its sweetness forever. This, Jung believed, is the highest form of success. Not the applause of others, but the peace that comes when your outer life finally matches the rhythm of your inner one. The golden prison opens, the mask falls away, and what remains is the rarest treasure of all, a life with soul.